Okay, well, this will be a complete change of pace. No longer remote sensing. We're going way, way, way smaller. Where I'm working on developing an ant size classifier. And if you haven't already heard me go on about ants, I think ants are really important. And first of all, they're everywhere. So I love showing this map. I think Dave Tao might have also shown it because it's basically like iNaturalist for ants, where people put observations of ants into the system, and then it shows really the diversity across the globe. So not only are they everywhere, they're extremely speciose, where we think there's maybe at least 14,000 species, if not more. And in all of these different habitats, you know, from highly urban settings to, you know, deep into the rainforest, they're found below this in the soil, all the way to the canopy. They're really important ecosystem engineers, really affecting everything within the environment. And I think, important to us, how do we go forward? Oh, sorry. It's just a little laggy. It does it on the screen. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. But important for us, I think they're a great candidate for computer vision methods. So they basically all have the same basic body plan, which means we theoretically could create a generalized model just to detect ants. I think that's really cool. And also a lot of traditional methods, they're quite numerous, so they're quite tedious to, you know, kind of track and follow them. So we really need automated methods to study ants. The ants I'm studying at the moment are leafcutter ants, and I love these ants. They're very cool because they basically have one of the most evolved societies where they have this fungus that they grow for food within the nest, and this fungus is only found within leafcutter ant colonies. It's not in the wild anymore. And they harvest leaf material, not to eat the leaf material, but to bring it back to the fungus and feed it to the fungus. So it's this complex process that it is even more complex because they have this different range of sizes within the colony, and these different sized workers have different tasks within the colonies. So I have a little cartoon up here where the largest ant, so this is mass on this kind of along this arc, and the largest workers are usually just soldiers. They're involved in defense. They don't do much else. They usually just kind of sit around in the colony. And then in the middle, those medium-sized workers are the ones doing all of the work. So they're cutting and transporting these leaf fragments. And then these really tiny workers tend to just stay in the nest and look after the brood and the fungus. So yeah, worker size tends to correlate with colony tasks along kind of this mass range. And you see the skew distribution, which will come into play later, where there's mostly a lot of smaller workers and not very many of these larger workers. I don't know what's happening with my slides, but okay, yeah, and I'm really interested in this feedback between the environment and this colony size distribution. So they need larger workers to harvest tougher plant material, where there's this correlation with larger ants and being able to reach more leaf resources. And they're really important in the environment overall, leaf cutters, where they account for 25% of herbivory in a lot of neotropical ecosystems. So if we could develop a system where we can detect what leaves they're bringing back to the nest, I think that's really interesting. And like this interplay between how the distribution of workers shifts depending on the environment is something that we need to look into further. E.O. Wilson did a lot of work in the 80s where he says that like leafcutter ants act near an ergonomic optimum, where basically they have a size distribution that represents, you know, the environment that they're living in. I think that was based on him looking at ants and saying, okay, that one looks about that size, and like classifying that way. So I think we really need to use automated methods to to do this more. And also something I'm passionate about is most ant studies, you look at one single colony, and like fitness, and that doesn't represent really much because natural selection acts on the level of the colony. So we really need to start doing multi-colony studies. And to do that, we need automated methods. Okay, so that's my ultimate goal right now though. Just working on creating an ant size classifier. So I have lots of cropped images of ants across the size range. And these are taken from frames of videos. And you can already see the cameras are from different perspectives, different heights. And all I wanted to do, first of all, is just see if we can separate out these different size ants. So I took my data set and did basically 2 different versions. So here's the size distribution again, where we see it's like very skewed towards the smaller workers. And the first pass I did, I just left it as an imbalanced data set, split 75 into train and 15% into the val. And I separated into classes. I decided on 5 classes. And this is just what I know about the behavior. So the first class I set as smaller than 2 milligrams, because I know that less than 2 milligrams, they don't cut the leaves and rarely leave the nest. And then that 2 to 5, 5 to 10 is like the main workforce of the colony. And then above that tends to be more of the defense involved workers. And I also know things about their shape. Something I didn't mention is their shape changes with size. And that's the whole idea of using this detection. So maybe the computer can just recognize shape instead of, counting pixels and see what it looks like. And so these kind of limits that I put, 0, 2, 5, 10, 15 is what I know kind of about how the shape changes and how the behavior changes. But yeah, I only have a validate set at the moment because I'm just testing things out, and I'll get a test set at a later date. And this first pass, I just did 15% in val and 75% in train. And then the second data set I used is this balanced data set that I split up into classes, not based on my knowledge of behavior, but based on how we can separate it so each class has the same amount of observations. And so that leads to classes that are really close in size. So these are the classes here where it's like 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And that like 2 to 6 is really hard to distinguish, and we'll see that later. But it is a way to have more equal training and more balanced data. Okay, so the first model I did, though, before I even got into these 5 classes, I wanted to see, can we even separate the large and the small ants? And we can, which is good. And the model I'm using, and this is just here to test out the model architecture. So I used Benny's code base and just kept it as a ResNet 18, and the loss function is cross entropy. And this was just after 8 epochs, and I just stopped it. And this is the val set where all but one, it classifies correctly from the large to the small. So I was like, okay, this is fine. Let's move on to the larger classification model. So I trained this imbalanced data set, and it does really well in training where it classifies everything correctly, but it's when you move into the validation set that it seems to really be struggling with the 2 biggest classes. So where you, class 4 is almost always class 3, class 3 is almost always class 2. So something weird is happening there, probably because of the data imbalance where they're just rarely seeing these largest classes and don't know what to classify it as. So that's how I ended up moving into the balanced data set. And you can see here that it's just with this accuracy and loss plot that it's just really not really learning, just memorizing this data set really quickly, and then kind of plateauing on the val, which is in the red. The blue is the train. So moved on to the balanced data set, and it really struggled with this, I think, just because of how similar the middle classes were. So as you can see in these confusion matrices, basically in the 5-class model, like it never predicts this class 1 or 2, and just decides that it's other things. And that's because if you look at these images with class 1 and 2, this is probably like a 3 milligram ant and close to a 5 milligram ant. They look pretty much the same. I don't think a human would be able to tell the difference. But we'll see. I also played around with 4 class, just curious, like kind of if this approach would work, and it still did pretty bad. So I decided to scrap that and go back to the imbalanced data set. This time adding data augmentation, which was quite fun, as you can see. So some of my images are from frames of videos. So they look quite similar, which I think was really reducing my performance. So as a first pass, I just added a lot of augmentation onto every single image. And that ended up just kind of being too much. The model wasn't learning at all. It just kind of plateaued at this accuracy of about 50%. So I thought, okay, maybe too much. So let's take it down. Oh, another point here is I realized when I was testing things out, in your data loader, a lot of times you can shuffle the data or just feed it in the order that it's listed, basically, in however you're loading it. And I turned this shuffle off in order to like kind of test out how the data augmentation looked and be able to match images. And then I didn't add it back in, and it really struggled to learn when I didn't shuffle these images, because it basically was feeding in one size class, another size class, and then another size class, and finally at the end getting like those largest images, and it just decided everything must be a 2 because there's so many images. So yeah, definitely making sure that you're feeding things into your model in the right order. But yeah, so finally I led to this third model where I have about 10% augmentation. So there's a 10% probability that one of these filters will be applied. So you can see a lot of them are flipped and rotated, or they have these patches taken out. And that seems to be about a good level where my model is finally training. You can see the train in blue and val in red. So it's actually struggling more with the training than the val this time. So that's really good, I think. And then this is after about 800 epochs, where you can see this nice diagonal, which is really good. And I think what's really exciting about this is the accuracy within one class. So like this diagonal and then the diagonals to the side is 99.8%. So that's, I think, really good because this is a continuous distribution. We really arbitrarily set these lines. So I think this just represents kind of where ants are falling between lines, and I'll show that in a minute. So pretty cool. There's still like a few that is having trouble with, and this one is basically the only one that was 2 off, outside of the classified 2, and I really don't know why. I don't have an explanation off the bat here, but that was interesting. And then
I bet it's because of the background.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the background's different, so it has like the edge of this container that might have played a role, but there's a lot of other ones with that as well, so I don't know. And there's ones where, what I was surprised about is it's not messing up on, there's ones where the ants are kind of climbing that I like was gonna clean out, then I was like, let's just run it and see how it goes, and it seems to do okay with like that different perspective band, not just top down, which is really interesting. But otherwise, where it seems to mess up, so 0 is it classified correctly. 1 is it classified too large, and then -1 is it classified too small. And then there's this one that it classified 2 classes above. And you can see where they're going wrong is really like right around these lines where I put my class bins, which really speaks to this kind of boundary problem where it's a continuous distribution, and it's like, well, it really looks like, you know, this class because it's an arbitrary threshold. So, yeah, I might move on to regression. I'll talk about that in a minute, but like use case of this model so far, I think it's cool that I can classify like basic behavioral classes, like these 5 classes, I think is actually kind of useful. The caveat is it's pretty simple situations where, you know, it's like a single ant in the images, and like this is a more realistic instance where just a lot of ants, a lot of leaves, probably more complex backgrounds than even this. So I really need improvements to be able to use it in a situation like this, but in a situation where I can like get ants singly, I could probably easily detect their size. And yeah, there's this issue of boundary classes, but I am excited that this like kind of perspective height doesn't seem to be affecting it too much. So to address the boundary classes, we might move on to regression. It's a work in progress. Need to figure out things with scaling my data sets, where right now I scaled between 0. Well, it's a work in progress. At one of my first passes, I decided to scale between 0 and 1. It was just predicting everything as a 0 and not working correctly. Might do something where I scale it in a different way, so like adding the sigmoid activation and shifting it down. But anyone who's done regression, love to talk to me more about it because I'm still figuring things out. Because right now it's just not training or working. But that's future work. And yeah, that's it basically. So next steps, implement that approach. I really want to add more of these larger classes because I just think that's going to help things more. And then if I do decide to go with these like classes, the bins, I want to add more of the boundary ants, so maybe it can learn that better. And then yeah, do a more precise study of actually looking at how camera height impacts the results, because I think that's really cool. That ends up not affecting things. And then eventually detection, because there's a lot I want to do there, but that is will be further down the road, maybe adding in leaf detection so we can actually look at what they're foraging on. And then I'll create a test set. And then maybe I've learned that the network doesn't really matter, so maybe I'll try switching out the network, but maybe not. And that's really it. Thank you, everyone. It's been... Yeah, these are some oopsies. I had more.
I'm sorry, is that like a law? Like what are we looking at?
I didn't, you know what it actually was, is I didn't order my epics and like my before I thought of it, and so it was just really
That's awesome. It's like the loss curve.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, Brian.
Super cool project, Natalie. In like an ideal world where the model's perfect and set up, what's your use case for this? Like, do you want to take this to the field and like track population or?
Yeah, absolutely. My like dream is to have basically at a colony entrance, just a little camera set up so we can like track, you know, basically the population over time, and then different resource use. Super fun as well. Yeah.
Casey?
Are these different castes of ants? Or like, is it a continuous distribution, or are there like distinct bins that you could put these in? And if so, are there different like allometric relationships between like head and thorax or whatever? Or?
Yeah, so interesting point. There are different allometric relationships, but it is on a continuous distributions. There isn't really a way to, you know, separate them out. They're on the same line rather than like being separated. There's some ants where they do have like complete separation. Like if you're comparing like the queen ant versus like workers, she's on different distributions, so you could separate that way. But it is taking into account theoretically these kind of allometric relationships where the shape is changing over size. And that's kind of why I think regression will be more interesting for that, because maybe it will take that into account with me, you know, with my eye thinking, oh, this is where they kind of look like the slope is changing.
Cool.
Yeah.
I have just a comment and then kind of a question for maybe both of you. But first, I think that it's really cool that you kind of reframed basically a regression problem as a classification problem, and the model like figured out that 4 is almost the same as 5. I just think that's like, it doesn't know the difference to start. So the fact that it like figured that out, I think is pretty neat. And then I was wondering, Sarah, do you think you can just like throw this at Mega Detector and it can give you like boxes of your ants and then you could feed those in? Like, how well do you think?
I actually think that you might be better off starting from something like the deep forest model, because it's a lot of things that are the same from like an aerial view. Like I think it's kind of like detecting birds in the wilderness, but just really scaled down. Mega Detector, you could try it on this, but it's very, very different from a camera trap image of a deer. So I have no idea. But I do think that the training ant detection model is something that is very doable. And so I think that it would be a very, very simple next step to take that super complicated ant thing, just like run a detector, run this size classifier and see what happens. And Tarun has an ant detector that he built, so.
It's there.
Yeah. Yeah, Jordan?
I really like your plot with distance to misclassification over class. I have another question, which is, how did you label your data? When you labeled your data, did you look at the head type and classify it by that, or did you
Just
put a marker on every ant?
No, just weighed them individually and got their mass. So.
So it was all individual ants in a tray, and
Yeah.
you weighed them before.
Yeah, which is tricky, which is if you scale up to the group situation, that is tricky because then you need to label them to remember which one is. Which is something there is this like head width relationship where basically you can use the head width mass, and I'm working on making that more accurate because right now there's too much of it.
You know when ants like they all walk in a row? Has anyone built a little thing where they walk over a scale?
Yeah. Okay. So I really want to build something like that. I've been thinking about it for a while. There's one researcher I know who has done it, but in a very different ant to this, but I think it'd be really cool and that like.
Because that's
Yeah,
like
ground truth.
massive ground truth.
Exactly, yeah. I'm trying to get, yeah, I'm trying to get a student to come engineer this, it'd be cool.
That's so cool. Okay, one more question? Tori.
We were talking about this the other day. I forgot if I was talking about this with you or with someone else, but and I forgot what the answer was. Someone asked again. But like an ant question, has someone studied or found out if there's like a strong correlation between the ant size and the size of the leaf that they carry?
Yeah.
And then could that be like easier? Because like at least when you look at these ants, like when I saw them in Costa Rica, you could see the line of leaves much more like easier than like actually the individual ants themselves.
Yeah, there is a correlation, but it's a really messy correlation. So I don't know if it would be a good indicator for the ant size because it doesn't take into account the thickness. So like a lot of times what ends up happening is the larger ants are cutting tougher leaves, but like around the same area. So like something from a video perspective, we're not gonna be able to pick up on that. But it is interesting where like maybe these methods could then allow us to clean up these relationships a bit better and see what's going on. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, cool. Awesome.